The airport smelled like wet concrete and old coffee, the kind of smell that clung to your clothes and refused to let go. Michael shifted nervously on his crutch, adjusting the strap of the worn backpack slung over his shoulder. In his arms, nestled against his chest, his puppy Max whimpered softly, sensing the unease in the air. It was supposed to be a new start, a short flight to a better life. That's what his mother had said when she pressed the ticket into his hand, her voice trembling even as she smiled. But Michael could feel it in his bones. Something was wrong. The stares had started the moment he entered the terminal. The long, hard looks, the whispered comments behind cupped hands. It wasn't new. He was used to the weight of other people's judgment. Black, disabled, poor. He had grown up being too much of everything the world hated. But today felt different. The terminal speakers crackled overhead, announcing final boarding for Flight 207. Michael swallowed the lump rising in his throat and made his way to the gate. Max snuggled close. The pup licked his chin, offering a tiny comfort that Michael clung to with all his might. He showed his ticket to the gate agent, who barely looked at him before waving him through with a look that said he was an inconvenience. He didn't care. He just wanted to get to his seat, close his eyes, and pretend for a few hours that the world outside the plane didn't exist. But as he boarded, the first blow landed. Not with fists, but with eyes. The flight attendant stood just past the threshold, arms crossed over her starched uniform, lips pressed into a thin line. Her gaze raked over him, lingering on his crutch, then his skin, and finally the small trembling mass of fur in his arms. Her nose wrinkled in distaste. "Pets go in carriers," she snapped, before Michael could even explain. Her voice was sharp enough to slice glass. "He's not a pet," Michael said quickly, voice low. "He's a service dog. I have the papers." He fumbled for the envelope his mother had given him, hands shaking slightly. But the woman was already shaking her head, her mouth twisting into something cruel. "I don't care what papers you have," she said. "Rules are rules. Animals don't belong in the cabin unless they're legitimate. You people are always trying to get around the system." "You people!" The words hit harder than any shove could have. Michael's cheeks burned with shame, with anger he couldn't show. He could feel the passengers behind him growing restless, the sighs, the impatient shifting of feet. He was holding them up. He was the problem. As always, he wanted to disappear. But Max whimpered again, and Michael stiffened his spine. He wasn't going to leave his best friend alone and scared in some dark cargo hold. "I have a right to bring him with me," he said, forcing the words past the tightness in his throat. The attendant leaned in close, her voice dropping to a hiss only he could hear. "Not on my plane." For a moment, Michael hesitated. He could see the gate just a few steps away. He could turn back. He could walk away, forget the whole thing. But he couldn't do that. He wouldn't. So he squared his shoulders, clutched Max tighter to his chest, and limped down the aisle toward his seat. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the entire plane was pressing against him. He thought it was over. He thought he could just sit down, keep quiet, and survive the flight. He had no idea that the real nightmare hadn't even started yet. The cabin of the plane was cramped and claustrophobic, the air thick with recycled oxygen and silent judgment. As Michael made his way down the narrow aisle, his crutch thudded dully against the worn carpet. Every few rows, someone turned to glance at him. Not kindly, not sympathetically, but with a blend of irritation and disdain, as if his mere presence had disrupted their otherwise comfortable flight. He could hear the whispers. Why is he even flying alone? Probably trying to get a free ride with that mutt. They'll let just about anyone on planes these days. Each word cut deeper than the last. Michael lowered his head, trying to focus on the seat number printed on his boarding pass, clutching Max closer to his chest. The puppy, sensing his distress, let out a soft, worried whine. When he finally reached his seat, a cramped spot in the very back of the plane, near the lavatories, Michael moved quickly, trying to settle in without attracting more attention. He tucked Max under his arm and awkwardly tried to store his backpack, the crutch getting tangled in the narrow space. His hands shook, the plane swaying slightly underfoot as passengers continued to file in. He felt the eyes of the flight attendant, the same woman from the gate, burning into him like hot coals. She stood a few rows away, arms still crossed, her mouth a thin, disapproving line. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She made a show of marching down the aisle toward him, heels clicking sharply, cutting through the quiet like gunshots. Passengers leaned into the aisle to watch, as if a spectacle were about to unfold. "You need to stow that animal properly," she snapped, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Passengers are complaining." Michael's cheeks flushed hot. He could feel every set of eyes trained on him, every silent accusation that he didn't belong here, that he was making a scene, causing problems. He opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off. "I don't care if you call it a service dog. I know your type, always looking for special treatment." Your type. The words slammed into him like a fist to the gut. He gripped Max tighter, feeling the small heartbeat under his fingers. This wasn't just about the dog. This was about him, about what he looked like, about what he represented to people like her. He tried to reason with her, tried to explain again, but his voice cracked and faltered under the crushing weight of the attention. The flight attendant sneered, shaking her head with mock pity. "People like you always think the rules don't apply," she said. "You're not special. You're just another problem we have to clean up." Passengers around him murmured in agreement. A woman 2 rows ahead shook her head, muttering something under her breath about standards getting lower every year. A man in a suit rolled his eyes so hard it was almost audible. Michael felt himself shrink into the seat, wishing he could disappear. His crutch slipped from where he had propped it, clattering noisily to the floor. The flight attendant smirked as if to say, "See?" Helpless, Max whimpered again, sensing his distress. Michael leaned his forehead against the window, pressing his eyes shut against the sting of tears. He wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of them. The plane began to taxi toward the runway. The flight attendant gave him one last glare before turning sharply and striding back to her station, her shoes clicking triumphantly on the floor. Michael sat in silence, the vibrations of the moving plane shaking through his bones. He could still hear the whispers, feel the weight of their judgment. Every second was a reminder that no matter how hard he tried, no matter how much he needed help, people would always see him as less. He wasn't a passenger. He wasn't a kid trying to get somewhere safe. He wasn't even a person to them. He was a problem to be handled. As the plane lifted off the ground and soared into the night sky, Michael tightened his grip on Max, the only soul who had ever looked at him without judgment, the only one who didn't care about the color of his skin, the limp in his step, or the fear in his eyes. But even Max wouldn't be safe from what was coming. Michael didn't know it yet, but this flight wasn't just a journey across the country. It was a descent into something much darker, a place where cruelty wore uniforms and hatred hid behind polite smiles. And soon, they would take from him the only thing he had left. The seatbelt sign blinked overhead as the plane climbed higher into the blackened sky. But for Michael, the cabin had become a coffin, a tight, suffocating space full of judgment and unspoken cruelty. His hands trembled as he stroked Max's fur, trying to anchor himself, trying to remember why he ever thought things might be different just because he was heading somewhere new. Around him, the quiet hostility festered. A woman across the aisle wrinkled her nose exaggeratedly every time she glanced his way, as if Max was a dirty, disease-carrying rat. A heavy-set man, a few rows up, muttered under his breath about special privileges and handouts, shooting Michael looks that felt like blows. Another woman shifted her purse protectively closer to her body, as if Michael might lunge at it any moment. He wanted to disappear into the seat, to melt into nothingness. But he couldn't. He existed, and his existence, black, disabled, carrying a small, anxious puppy, was enough to offend them. The flight attendant had vanished briefly after takeoff, but Michael had no illusions that she was done with him. Every time he heard the soft thud of her heels against the thin carpet, his muscles tensed, waiting for the next attack. It came sooner than he expected. The drink cart rattled down the narrow aisle, the flight attendant pushing it with mechanical efficiency, smiling tightly at the other passengers. But when she reached Michael's row, the smile dropped like a mask, revealing the contempt underneath. "No food or drink for you until that dog is properly contained," she said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. Michael flushed hot with shame. "I told you," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. He's a service animal. I have the paperwork. The attendant's laugh was short and cruel. Paperwork from where? She sneered. Some website you paid $20 to. You think carrying a crutch around and dragging that mutt on board makes you special? Heads turned. Passengers leaned in, their eyes gleaming with curiosity and disdain. Michael felt like a sideshow attraction. The crippled boy pretending to need help, daring to think he deserved to be here. He wanted to protest, to stand up for himself, but the weight of every gaze pressed him down into his seat. Without waiting for a response, the flight attendant leaned forward and grabbed the small leash attached to Max's harness. Michael's heart lurched. Please, no, he gasped, reaching instinctively, but his fingers slipped on the slick nylon leash. Max yelped in confusion, his tiny paws scrabbling against the armrest as the flight attendant jerked him free. The world seemed to tilt sideways. The other passengers said nothing. Some looked away. Some smirked. None intervened. Animals like that belong under the plane, the flight attendant barked. Not here, slobbering all over everything, bothering paying customers. She said it with such venom that it was clear she didn't just mean the dog. Michael tried to stand, tried to push himself up on his crutch to go after Max, but the crutch wobbled, and he stumbled, crashing hard against the side of the seat. Pain exploded up his side, but the greater agony was the sight of Max being dragged down the aisle, whining, terrified, looking back with wide, desperate eyes. Wait, Michael cried, but his voice cracked, choked by helplessness. The flight attendant didn't even glance back. Tears blurred his vision as he struggled upright. The humiliation was complete. He could feel the judgment-like heat radiating from the other passengers. Not pity, not concern, but a smug satisfaction, as if they were all silently thinking, good. Finally, someone put him in his place. A man nearby chuckled under his breath. Entitlement's got consequences, kid. Michael slumped back into his seat, fists clenched so tightly his nails bit into his palms. He blinked rapidly, forcing the tears away, refusing to let them see him cry. The seatbelt sign flickered again. Turbulence rocked the plane lightly, but it wasn't the altitude that made Michael's stomach churn. It was the heavy, crushing realization that no matter how much he fought, no matter how right he was, people like him were never meant to win in places like this. The minutes dragged into hours. Michael sat rigid, staring at the empty space where Max had been, trying to breathe through the waves of panic that threatened to drown him. His crutch lay awkwardly across his lap, an ever-present reminder of his weakness. Every so often, someone would walk past to the bathroom and glance down at him with something like amusement, as if he were a pathetic sideshow they could conveniently forget after landing. He heard snippets of conversations. Casual. Cruel. They're just handing out fake service dog papers now. Probably some scam. Get sympathy points. They always pull the race card when they get caught. Michael's jaw ached from clenching it so tightly. He thought about his mother. About the hopeful way she had kissed him goodbye, her words of encouragement. It's a new beginning, baby. A fresh start. But fresh starts didn't exist for people like him. Not when the world was built to crush him before he even got the chance to stand. Hours later, as the plane began its descent, the flight attendant returned. She knelt beside his seat, her expression composed, but her voice dripping with false sympathy. Your pet will be waiting for you at the cargo desk, she said smoothly. Assuming it survives the flight. Not all of them do, you know. Her smile was razor sharp. Michael stared at her, numb. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. What could words do against a system that had decided he was less than human before he even boarded the plane? The wheels hit the tarmac with a jolt. The flight attendant stood and smoothed her skirt. Maybe next time, you'll think twice before causing trouble. And with that, she walked away, leaving Michael sitting alone in the too-cold cabin, the empty seat beside him, a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. As the plane taxied toward the terminal, the other passengers rose and gathered their belongings, chattering excitedly about vacations and business meetings. No one spared him a second glance. Michael sat frozen, waiting for the plane to empty, waiting for the nightmare to end. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. This wasn't just one flight. This was his life. A fight he hadn't asked for, against enemies he couldn't always see, but whose cruelty left deeper scars than any wound. He tightened his hand around the worn leather strap of his crutch. His body ached. His heart ached even more. But even in the wreckage of humiliation, something stirred deep inside him. Not hope, exactly, but a hardening, a steely resolve. They could try to strip him of dignity, of humanity. They could try to teach him his place. But he wasn't finished, not yet, and neither was the story. At this point in the story, we'll take a brief pause. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you listening from? And have you ever experienced something similar in your own life? Your feedback means so much to us, and we truly appreciate your support. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this. We'll continue right after this, so stay tuned. Michael didn't know how long he sat there, his crutch still propped awkwardly against his lap. The seatbelt sign flickered above him as the plane began its descent into the city, but it felt like time itself had stopped. His heart still pounded in his chest. The images of the flight attendant dragging Max away burned into his mind. The way she yanked the puppy out of his arms without a second thought. The coldness in her eyes. The snide comments about his dog being just another scam. They always think that. They always think you're not enough, not human enough. The moment the plane landed, it felt like someone had pushed him into the ground. The last few minutes of the flight had been a blur of internal chaos, but now reality settled back in with a brutal clarity. He had no idea what he was supposed to do next. His heart ached at the thought of Max, alone and scared somewhere in the cargo hold. The thought that someone would treat his best friend like that, as if he were just another piece of baggage to be tossed aside, made his blood boil. He wanted to get off the plane, to run straight to the cargo area and demand Max back, but the tightness in his chest wouldn't let him move. The humiliation of the entire flight weighed him down, like an anchor, pulling him deeper into the ground. When the plane finally stopped at the gate and the seatbelt sign turned off, Michael hesitated. He looked around at the other passengers, who were already standing, collecting their things and chattering excitedly about their plans. To them, the flight was over. To them, it was just another routine. But to Michael, it felt like the beginning of something much darker. As he slowly stood, a deep, trembling breath escaped his chest. His crutch scraped the floor as he awkwardly moved toward the aisle. But as he did, he caught a glimpse of the flight attendant. She was standing by the door now, smiling tightly at the other passengers, her face an expressionless mask, as if she hadn't just ruined everything for him. But Michael couldn't let it go. Not now. Not after everything she'd done. He stepped forward, forcing his legs to move, the weight of the crutch digging into his palm. She turned, seeing him approach, and her smile faltered just for a second before she quickly corrected it, like it was rehearsed. "You need to stay seated until everyone else exits," she said loudly, making sure everyone nearby could hear. "You're blocking the aisle." Michael's stomach churned. The bile rose in his throat, but he swallowed it down. "Where is my dog?" he asked, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. Her eyes flicked to the side, avoiding his gaze. "You'll pick him up in the cargo area," she replied, her words clipped, dismissive. "I already told you that. I want him now," Michael said, his voice rising without his consent. "He's my service dog. You can't just take him and treat him like luggage." She straightened slightly, her smile freezing, and she took a step back. "You should be more grateful. Some of us are trying to make this flight as smooth as possible for everyone. People like you always cause problems. Maybe next time, think twice before dragging your dog onto a plane." The words stung like a slap across the face. People like you. He had heard those words before, but never so openly, so clearly. She didn't even try to hide it. She wasn't just angry at his dog, she was angry at him. At who he was. At what he looked like. At everything that made him different. Her face held a mixture of contempt and disgust that he couldn't shake. He could feel the heat rising in his chest again, the anger bubbling up. But he was too tired to argue anymore. Instead, he forced out a shaky breath and turned toward the front of the plane. He had to find Max. He had to make sure he was okay. The terminal was busy. Passengers rushing past, their faces tired and impatient as they retrieved their bags and left the gate. Michael walked slowly toward the baggage claim area, gripping his crutch like it might be the only thing keeping him upright. He hated the feeling of everyone else brushing past him, their footsteps quick and dismissive, as if they couldn't be bothered to give him a second thought. To them, he was just another passenger, just another inconvenience. But his eyes were fixed on the signs for baggage claim. He wasn't going to leave without Max. Not after everything he'd been through. Not after the way that woman had treated him. When he reached the luggage area, the lights were harsh, too bright, and the conveyor belt hummed loudly. The clattering sound of bags coming and going drowning out the voices around him. Michael's stomach twisted as he approached the desk where an attendant was standing, scanning tickets for people picking up their bags. The attendant didn't look at him when he approached, but Michael didn't care. He knew what he needed to ask. "Excuse me," he said, his voice small. "I'm here to pick up my dog." The attendant barely glanced at him. "You mean your pet?" she asked, not bothering to hide the scorn in her voice. She emphasized the word pet, as if it was the most ridiculous thing she had ever heard. "It's a service animal," Michael corrected quietly. "A dog. I was told he was put in the cargo hold." The attendant's expression faltered for a moment, then she shrugged. "If it's a service dog, you'll need to go to the special pickup area. You should have been informed when you boarded." Michael felt the weight of her words hit him like a punch. Special pickup area. It was as if he wasn't even on the same level as the other passengers, like he didn't belong in this space at all. She wasn't even looking at him anymore, her attention already shifting to the next person who needed help. "Where is it?" Michael asked again, struggling to keep the desperation out of his voice. She sighed, her patience wearing thin. "Gate 17. Just follow the signs. It'll be there." Gate 17 was on the far side of the terminal, and it took Michael what felt like an eternity to get there. Every step felt like a mile. His heart beat faster with each passing second, and his breath caught in his throat. What if Max wasn't there? What if the flight attendant had lied to him? What if? But he couldn't think about that. He couldn't afford to. When he finally reached the area, a small desk behind a thick glass window greeted him. There was no one there except for an empty counter, an industrial cage behind it. His stomach dropped as he approached. He wanted to shout. He wanted to tear the place apart. But instead he stood there, staring at the empty space where Max was supposed to be. He waited for what felt like forever, until a uniformed worker finally appeared. "Can I help you?" the worker asked, his tone too casual. "I'm here for my dog," Michael said, his voice tight with tension. The worker glanced down at his computer screen, clicking his tongue. Looks like your animal was misplaced. There's been a mix-up, and we'll need a few more minutes." Michael's chest tightened. "Misplaced?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean misplaced?" The worker's eyes flicked toward the back of the room, as if not wanting to make eye contact. "It might take a while to sort out. It could take a few hours. We'll call you when we have an update." Michael's world crumbled. He stood there in stunned silence, the feeling of the terminal crowd rushing past him like an angry tide. This wasn't just about losing Max anymore. This was about everything. His disability, his race, his very existence had been reduced to this. A mistake, a problem, someone's inconvenience. The hours dragged on like an eternity, every second stretching longer than the last. Michael stood frozen at the counter, his crutch digging painfully into his hand, while the baggage claim area buzzed around him. People passed by, some with their faces buried in their phones, others chatting casually about their trips. None of them seemed to notice the boy standing there, his heart racing, his stomach twisted in a knot of fear and frustration. None of them saw the growing weight of his exhaustion, the pressure of being invisible, of being reduced to nothing but an inconvenience. "Do you need any help?" A worker called out to him, as if he had just appeared in the terminal, as if he hadn't been standing there, waiting, for what felt like hours. Michael couldn't even bring himself to look at the person. He simply shook his head. A vague, tired gesture that didn't acknowledge anything but the overwhelming sense of helplessness. His mind was consumed by one thing: Max. The way the flight attendant had treated him, the way she had dragged his dog away, as though Max were nothing more than an object, an afterthought, a commodity. And now, here he was, in an airport that was supposed to be a place of transit, of connection, yet the only thing that connected him to the rest of the world was this cold, humiliating waiting game. The thought of Max alone somewhere, in the bowels of the airport, in some dark, cold storage area, tore at his chest. He tried not to think about it, tried not to let the images of Max locked away in some tiny cage overwhelm him, but he couldn't help it. The fear crept in like poison, filling his lungs with a suffocating pressure. He turned to the worker behind the counter, unable to contain the wave of emotion that hit him. "Where is he? Where is my dog?" His voice cracked, desperation flooding his words. He wasn't just asking for information anymore, he was pleading. The worker didn't respond immediately. She glanced at her screen, her fingers tapping idly on the keyboard. When she finally looked up, it was with the same disinterested gaze she had given to everyone else that day. "I told you," she said, her tone almost dismissive. "We'll let you know when we have an update. It might take a while." Michael's face flushed with a mix of anger and shame. A while? How could they treat him like this? How could they stand there, offering nothing but vague assurances, while his dog, his lifeline, was left in their hands, alone and scared? "I need him now," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't care how long it takes. I don't care what procedures you need to follow. My dog is in your care. You're supposed to take care of him." The worker barely looked up. "It's out of my hands, kid. You'll get your dog when we've finished sorting things out." Out of his hands. Michael's fingers curled into fists around the crutch, the sharp pain of his nails digging into his palm barely registering. It wasn't just the dog that had been taken from him. It was his dignity, his humanity, his right to exist as a person deserving of respect. He had been humiliated, degraded, made to feel smaller than everyone around him, all for the crime of existing the way he did. Disabled, black, and now, powerless to get his dog back. He turned away from the counter, too tired to argue. What more could he say? What was left for him to say? There was nothing. Nothing except to wait and wonder if he would ever be reunited with Max. The hours passed in an agonizing blur. Michael wandered around the terminal, his eyes fixed on the floor, the weight of the world pressing down on him. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. His mind was too far away, consumed by the helplessness he felt, trapped in a world that refused to see him as anything more than a problem to be solved. He had become invisible, a shadow moving among shadows. He finally found a seat near the windows, the glass cold against his cheek as he rested his head. The sounds of the airport faded into the background, his own heartbeat the loudest thing in his ears. For a moment, he thought about closing his eyes, just letting the weight of the day carry him away. But he couldn't. Not with Max still out there. Not with that woman's cruel face haunting him. How had it gotten this far? How had it gone from a simple flight to this nightmare? How had one person's hatred, one flight attendant's cruelty, unraveled everything? It wasn't just her. It wasn't just the flight attendant who had dragged Max away. It was the system. It was the world that told him over and over again that he didn't belong. It was the world that had decided, long before he even stepped foot on that plane, that people like him weren't worthy of respect, that people like him didn't deserve to take up space. He thought about the other passengers, the ones who had looked away when the flight attendant pulled Max out of his arms, the ones who had silently judged him, the ones who had whispered and laughed behind their hands. He was invisible to them, and worse, he was a target, a symbol of everything they hated. Michael closed his eyes for a moment, the tears threatening again. But he couldn't let them fall. He wouldn't let them fall. He had no idea how long he had been sitting there, when a loud voice broke through his thoughts. "Excuse me." He opened his eyes to see a man standing in front of him, his face tense, and his eyes flicking nervously around the terminal. He looked like a fellow passenger, unremarkable, except for the nervous energy that seemed to radiate from him. The man's lips twitched, and then he spoke again. Are you the kid with the service dog? Michael's heart skipped a beat. Yes, he said, his voice hoarse. Where is he? Please, tell me where he is. The man shifted uncomfortably, looking at the floor for a moment, before making eye contact again. I saw what happened. I heard the flight attendant. It was messed up, man. Michael didn't know what to say. His head was spinning. What do you know? Where is he? The man hesitated, and for a moment, Michael wondered if he was going to walk away, but instead, he spoke again, his voice lower this time, as if sharing a secret. I saw the dog, man. They're not giving him back. They're keeping him in the back, locked up. I don't know why, but... He trailed off, unsure of how to continue. Michael's hands shook. He knew what the man was trying to say without saying it. They were keeping Max. They weren't giving him back. It didn't matter that the dog was a service animal. It didn't matter that Michael had the paperwork, the right to have him by his side. Max was just another inconvenience, another problem for them to deal with. The man seemed to realize what he had said and quickly added, I'm sorry, man. I really am. But I don't think you're going to get him back today. Michael's chest tightened. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't process what he was hearing. His head spun. The crushing reality of it hit him. But he couldn't let himself fall apart here. Not in front of everyone. Not in front of the world that had decided long ago that people like him didn't matter. I'll get him back, Michael said, his voice firm, even though it was shaking. I have to. The rest of the day blurred into nothingness. The terminal had emptied out by the time Michael was finally called to the back. His crutch felt heavier than ever as he moved slowly down the sterile hallway, the echo of his footsteps the only sound. When he reached the desk, the attendant barely looked up. You're here for the dog? She asked, a bored tone in her voice. Yes, Michael said, his voice cold. I'm here for Max. The attendant typed something on her computer before pushing a form toward him. Sign this, she said, not looking at him, and we'll release the animal. Michael signed the form with a shaky hand, his heart hammering in his chest. When she slid it across the counter, he hesitated, afraid that something would stop him. But when she finally looked up, she merely nodded. Your dog's waiting outside. Michael couldn't believe it. He walked out of the room, finally, to the side area where he saw Max being returned to him. The puppy's tail wagged weakly as Michael knelt down to scoop him up. But as he held Max in his arms, he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't over. Not yet. Not by a long shot. The pain of what had happened still clung to him, sharp and heavy. But as Max licked his cheek, Michael knew one thing for sure. This fight was just beginning. Michael stood in the terminal, his fingers still trembling from the sheer weight of everything that had happened. Max was in his arms now, but the emptiness inside him lingered like a ghost. The world felt too loud, too bright, and for the first time Michael realized how utterly alone he was. Alone in a world that didn't understand him, didn't care about him, and had decided long ago that someone like him, someone who was black, disabled, and needed help just to navigate the world, didn't matter. The flight attendant had shown him that. The other passengers had shown him that. The whole system had shown him that. As he walked through the terminal, Max snuggled against him, sensing his unease. The puppy's presence was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. He knew he had to do something. He couldn't just let this go, not after everything he'd been through. The cruelty, the humiliation, it all burned too brightly inside him, demanding action. He had to make them see him. He had to make them see Max. They weren't just some inconveniences, some problems to be shuffled away into a cargo hold. They were people, real people, with rights, with dignity. But how could he make them see that? How could he stand up against an entire system built on prejudice and dehumanization? The pain in his chest wasn't just from his heart. It was from the weight of history, from every injustice that had been dealt to him simply because of who he was. He couldn't change the past, but he could fight for the future. As he reached the baggage claim, he paused and took a deep breath. His heart raced and his hands clenched around Max's leash. He wasn't sure how he had come to this point, but the reality was simple. He had to make noise. He had to be heard. He couldn't be silent anymore. His voice, weak and unsure at first, had to be heard. He would make it heard. He turned to the nearest airport official, a man in a uniform who looked more interested in his phone than in anything going on around him. "Excuse me," Michael said, his voice a little more firm than it had been earlier. The man didn't even look up at first, his eyes glued to the screen. "I need help. You need to do something about the way I was treated. This—" He gestured toward Max. "This is my service dog, and I was humiliated, dragged, told that my rights didn't matter." The official finally looked up, his expression a mixture of annoyance and apathy. "Sir, I'm sure everything was done according to protocol. You're not allowed to bring pets onto the plane. This is an airport. We have rules." Michael's chest tightened as he struggled to maintain control. "He's not a pet. He's a service animal. I have the documentation." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Well, it doesn't matter. You should have followed the rules. We have rules for a reason." Michael's blood boiled. "We have rules for a reason." The man's words echoed in his mind, a cruel mockery of everything Michael had been through. It wasn't about the rules. It wasn't about the paperwork. It was about control. It was about the way people like him were made to feel small, invisible, unworthy of respect. He couldn't back down now. He couldn't let them silence him. Not again. "No," Michael said, his voice sharp, louder now, drawing attention from a few people nearby. "No, this is about racism. This is about me being disabled and black and being treated like I don't matter. You don't get to treat me this way. I have every right to have my service dog with me. You don't get to decide what's acceptable based on your own prejudices." The airport official's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. "I'm sorry, sir, but you're causing a disturbance. You'll have to leave." "I'm not leaving," Michael said, his voice cold. "I'm not leaving until I get an answer, until someone acknowledges that what happened to me was wrong." The man looked around, clearly uncomfortable with the growing attention they were attracting. "Please step aside," he said, his voice now more forceful. "If you don't calm down, I'll be forced to call security." Michael didn't budge. His body trembled with the weight of the injustice, but he was done shrinking. He was done letting people walk over him. The fire in his chest, the heat of the anger and humiliation, grew hotter. This wasn't just about Max anymore. This was about all of it. The years of feeling like he was never enough. The years of feeling like people could treat him however they wanted without consequence. This was about the system, and it had to be fought. "Call security," Michael said, his voice unyielding. "Call whoever you want, but you're going to listen to me. I've had enough." More eyes were on him now. He could feel the stares, the whispers, the quiet judgment. But this time, it didn't matter. He wasn't their problem anymore. He wasn't going to be their target anymore. He was done being invisible. His heart thundered in his chest, but he stood his ground. A few minutes passed, long enough for Michael to feel the weight of the stares pressing in, suffocating him. The official, now visibly frustrated, walked away, disappearing into the crowd. He returned moments later, not with security, but with a woman in a business suit, her demeanor cold and professional. She approached him with the kind of calm detachment he had grown so used to. "Sir," she began, her tone polite but dismissive. "I understand you're upset, but you need to calm down." Michael's hand tightened around Max's leash. "You need to tell me what happened. You need to tell me why I was treated this way." The woman looked at him with an expression that said she had already made up her mind about him. "We followed the rules, sir. There's nothing to investigate. The flight attendant did what she had to do." What she had to do. Michael's voice rose, the anger cutting through the politeness. "She dragged my service dog away like he was trash. She humiliated me. And you're telling me that's okay? You're telling me that this is the system I'm supposed to trust?" The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't think you fully understand the situation." "No," Michael said, his voice raw with emotion. "I understand it perfectly. You see me, you see people like me, and you decide we don't matter. You decide we're not worth the same respect. That's the system you're talking about. That's what happened here. I'm done with it." The woman's eyes flicked to the side, her gaze sweeping over the terminal. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you refuse, I'll call the authorities." Michael's heart dropped. Call the authorities. The words were meant to intimidate him, to remind him of his place. They weren't just telling him to leave the airport. They were telling him that he didn't belong here. Not in this world, not with them. But Michael wasn't scared anymore. "Call them," he said, the words steady, the fire inside him burning brighter. "But I'm not leaving. Not until I get answers. Not until you tell me why I've been treated like this, why I've been treated like less than human, why you're willing to throw me away because I'm black, disabled, and trying to make a life for myself. You don't get to decide that anymore." The woman's face twisted, and for a brief moment, Michael thought she might say something, that maybe she would see him, acknowledge the injustice. But instead, she turned on her heel and walked away, her heels clicking against the tile floor with the unmistakable sound of indifference. Michael stood there, fists clenched, Max still nestled in his arms. He had spoken his truth, but that wasn't the end. It wasn't even the beginning. It was just the first step in a long fight. The world wasn't ready for him to speak up, but he wasn't waiting for it anymore. He wasn't waiting for anything. He was going to make them hear him, and if they didn't listen, he would make them. This was his stand, and nothing, no one, was going to silence him again. Michael stood still in the bustling airport terminal, his crutch digging into the hard floor beneath him. Max, nestled in his arms, was the only source of comfort in an otherwise overwhelming sea of noise and chaos. The murmurs of passengers, the incessant announcements overhead, all blurred into a distant hum, as Michael's thoughts spiraled in a whirlwind of frustration and disbelief. How had things gotten so out of control? How had a simple flight turned into a battle he never wanted to fight? His heart still ached from the earlier humiliation, from the way the flight attendant had so callously taken Max away from him, as if he had no right to have the dog he needed. Michael wasn't blind to the way others looked at him, the small glances of judgment and disdain that followed him through the airport. He could feel their eyes on him like a weight, their silent questions. "What are you doing here? Why are you making a scene?" Hanging in the air. He had always known that the world could be unkind, that people would judge him for his disability, for his skin. But today, it felt like the cruelty was too much to bear. The thought of Max, his only source of comfort in a world that often made him feel invisible, being dragged away like that, left in some cold cargo hold without a second thought, made his stomach churn. He couldn't stand the thought of it. The sense of helplessness had taken root in him, but something else was beginning to stir, something stronger. He couldn't sit back anymore. He couldn't let this slide. He had to do something. Michael's steps felt heavy as he moved through the terminal, his mind racing with thoughts of how to confront the injustice he'd faced. He was exhausted, mentally, emotionally, physically. But there was no going back. Not now. He had been humiliated enough, treated like a nuisance, but he refused to stay silent any longer. The sense of powerlessness that had filled him after the incident on the plane had given way to something else. Anger, yes, but also a quiet resolve. He had to make them see him. He had to make them understand that he deserved the same respect as anyone else. The noise of the terminal seemed distant now as he walked toward the customer service desk. He could feel the eyes of those around him once again, but this time he didn't care. He wasn't going to shrink away. He wasn't going to apologize for existing. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside. The woman behind the desk looked up, clearly uninterested in the interaction, but when she saw Michael standing there, she put down the phone and gave him a brief, impatient glance. "How can I help you?" she asked, her tone flat. "I need to speak to someone about what happened on the flight," Michael replied, keeping his voice firm. "About my service dog." The woman's expression didn't change. She looked at him like he was just another complaint to deal with. "Please explain the issue." Michael took a deep breath. "I was on flight 207. The flight attendant took my service dog away from me. I was told I couldn't have him on board, even though he's my service dog. I was humiliated, and I want to know what the airline plans to do about it." The woman's gaze shifted for a moment, Then she sighed, tapping at her keyboard as if trying to find some way to brush him off. We'll need to look into it. You can file a formal complaint, but you'll have to wait for the results. Michael's frustration flared. I'm not here to file a complaint. I'm here because I want to know why I was treated like that. I was made to feel like I don't belong, like I don't have the right to fly with my service dog. The woman looked at him blankly, her eyes cold, unbothered. Sir, if you have a problem with how you were treated, you'll have to follow the procedure. I suggest you file a complaint, and we'll get back to you. It was clear that she wasn't listening, that she had already made up her mind about the situation, about him. The words, follow the procedure, echoed in his mind like a mantra, and it made him sick. He wasn't just another form to be processed. He wasn't just another problem to be ignored. He was a person. He was a human being who had been treated with cruelty and disrespect. Michael clenched his jaw, the sting of humiliation still fresh. So that's it? He asked, his voice tight with barely contained emotion. You're just going to sweep this under the rug and forget about it? The woman didn't respond. She just turned back to her screen, clearly done with the conversation. Michael stood there for a moment, staring at her, trying to steady his breathing. This was the world he lived in. A world where his dignity didn't matter, where his rights didn't matter, where the pain he felt was just another inconvenience for people like her. And yet, the anger inside him kept building, kept pressing him forward. This wasn't just about the flight anymore. This wasn't just about Max. It was about everything. It was about how people like him were treated every single day. It was about how society had learned to ignore and dismiss people like him. He wasn't just fighting for his dog. He was fighting for himself, for everyone who had been pushed to the margins, for everyone who had been silenced by a system that refused to acknowledge their humanity. And he was done waiting, done being invisible, done being silent. He turned and walked away from the counter, his crutch thumping heavily with each step. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he couldn't stay there anymore. The humiliation of the past few hours had left its mark, but he knew he couldn't let it define him. He was stronger than that. Max, still tucked close to him, gave a small whine of comfort, and Michael looked down at the dog, the only being in the world who had never judged him. They can't take you from me again, he thought, the fire in his chest reigniting. As he walked through the terminal, he realized that he wasn't alone. There were others who had been silenced, who had been made to feel less than, who had been told that their voices didn't matter. But they did. They all did. And Michael knew he had to do something more. He couldn't just walk away from this. Not when everything he had been through, everything that had happened to him, was part of a bigger story. The story of a world that needed to change. The story of people who would no longer remain silent, and he would be one of the voices who would make sure that change happened. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time, he felt a spark of hope. Not that the system would change overnight, but that his voice, his stand, could be the beginning of something bigger, something better. The morning after the incident in the terminal, Michael felt like he was drowning. The weight of everything, the cruelty, the humiliation, the long drawn-out feeling of not belonging, pressed down on him, harder than ever. He had Max at least, his dog, his companion, his constant reminder that he wasn't alone in the world. But even with Max by his side, the feeling of isolation hadn't faded. The world around him still seemed cold and indifferent, as if the system itself was working against him. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to make it right. But he did know one thing. He wasn't going to stop fighting. Not now. Not ever. The days that followed were a blur of calls and emails, each one more dismissive than the last. The airline's customer service department seemed more interested in brushing him off than actually addressing the problem. Every call felt like a step back, like the world was tightening its grip around him. Every time he tried to explain what had happened, he was met with excuses. It's our policy. You were disruptive. It's out of our hands. Michael had come to expect it. He had come to expect that people like him, people who were disabled, who were black, who were seen as lesser by the world around them, would always have to fight harder, be louder, just to be heard. The system wasn't built for him. The world wasn't built for people like him. He had learned that lesson the hard way. But something inside him was different now. The weight of every injustice he'd suffered, not just in the airport, but throughout his life, began to feel like fuel. He wasn't just fighting for Max anymore. He was fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, who had ever been told they didn't matter, that they didn't belong. The problem was that the more he tried to push back, the more the world seemed to push back harder. The airport gave him the runaround, refusing to take responsibility for the flight attendant's behavior. He filed formal complaints, sent emails, made phone calls, but no one was willing to listen. It was as if they all had their own preconceptions, their own biases, their own comfortable assumptions that people like Michael didn't belong in these spaces, not in the airport, not on the plane, and certainly not in a position to demand respect. People like Michael were supposed to stay in the background, not demand attention. They were supposed to be invisible. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the airline. It was cold, detached, and apologetic in the most impersonal way. They regretted the incident. They acknowledged that the flight attendant's behavior had been inappropriate. But there was no real accountability. No one had been fired. No one had been reprimanded. The letter promised that the airline was looking into it and would review their policies. Michael read it over and over again, the words feeling hollow and meaningless. It didn't matter how many apologies they sent his way. It didn't matter how many promises they made. He knew the truth. They were trying to sweep it all under the rug, to make it go away. They wanted him to be quiet, to stop asking questions, to just accept that it was part of life. But Michael wouldn't accept it. He couldn't. It was a week later when he decided to take matters into his own hands. He wasn't going to wait for the airline to do the right thing. He wasn't going to wait for anyone to give him permission to be heard. He was going to make them listen. Michael reached out to a local news station. He knew that if anyone could make the airline listen, it was the media. The story wasn't just about him. It was about every single person who had ever been ignored. Every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't matter. It was about racism, about ableism, about the ways in which people like him were treated as invisible. It was about standing up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced by the same system. The reporter, a woman named Sarah, was receptive to the story. She listened patiently as Michael explained everything that had happened. The treatment on the plane, the way the flight attendant had dragged Max away from him, the endless bureaucracy that had followed. He spoke about the shame he had felt, the way his heart had broken as he watched the woman take Max from his arms. He told her about the silence that followed, the way he had been ignored by everyone who should have helped him. "I'm tired of being invisible," Michael told her, his voice shaking with emotion. "I'm tired of being treated like I don't matter. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for respect. I'm asking for basic human decency. That's all." Sarah's eyes softened as she listened to him. "We'll run the story," she said quietly. "But we need to make sure we get all the facts. We'll need the full timeline, documentation, everything." Michael agreed, knowing that this wasn't just about his story anymore. This was about everything that needed to change. It was about exposing the ways in which people like him were treated like second-class citizens, as though they had no place in the world. He was going to make them see him, and he was going to make them see everyone else who had been pushed aside. When the story aired on local television, Michael's phone rang off the hook. People called to thank him, to share their own stories, to tell him they had been through the same thing. He wasn't the only one who had been ignored, who had been silenced. It was a pattern, a deep-rooted injustice that was woven into the fabric of society. And now, for the first time, the truth was out there for everyone to see. But with the attention came the backlash. The airline issued a public statement, promising that they were reviewing their policies and that they took the matter seriously. But the more Michael read the statement, the more he realized it was just another attempt to placate the public, to avoid taking any real responsibility. They promised reforms, but none of it felt real. None of it felt like they were truly acknowledging what had happened. It wasn't enough. The comments on social media were even worse. People called him an attention seeker, accused him of making a big deal out of nothing. Some even questioned why he had a dog in the first place, implying that he was faking his disability, that he was somehow undeserving of the accommodations he needed. The hate was rampant, and it cut deeper than any words had before. It was one thing to face this kind of treatment in person. It was another to face it online, where every hateful comment felt like a punch to the gut. But even through the hate, Michael found something he hadn't expected: support. The more the story spread, the more people reached out. Messages flooded his inbox from other disabled individuals, people of color, and allies who understood exactly what he was going through. They shared their own stories of discrimination, of being treated like less than human, of having their voices silenced. They didn't let the negativity break them. They lifted each other up. And for the first time, Michael didn't feel so alone. He understood now that this fight was bigger than just one flight, bigger than just one person's experience. It was a fight for equality, for dignity, for respect. It was about standing up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been marginalized. And even though the road ahead was long and uncertain, he was ready to keep fighting. Because the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The days that followed were a blur of emotions for Michael. He had become a symbol, not just for himself, but for so many others who had silently endured similar injustices. His story had spread like wildfire, drawing attention from news outlets, social media platforms, and everyday people who could relate to the humiliation, the isolation, and the emotional toll that came with being treated as less than. But with all the attention came a new wave of challenges. While some people reached out to support him, offering words of solidarity and shared experiences, others were quick to criticize him. The negative comments, the judgmental stares, the "why didn't you just keep quiet" attitudes, they were never far from his mind. It was as though his fight for dignity had made him a target for people who were comfortable in their indifference, who didn't understand what it was like to be continuously told that you don't matter. Every day, Michael was reminded of how quickly the world could turn against someone who dared to speak out. But despite the hate, despite the hurt, there was a growing sense inside him that something was changing, something he couldn't ignore anymore. He wasn't just fighting for Max anymore. He was fighting for something much bigger. A week had passed since the story aired on the news, and the phone calls, messages, and emails continued to pour in. People from all walks of life reached out to him, sharing their own struggles with racism, ableism, and inequality. There was a woman with a disability who had been told to leave a restaurant because her service dog wasn't welcome, a man of color who had been subjected to profiling and harassment by law enforcement, a mother of a child with special needs who was repeatedly excluded from school events because of her child's disability. Each story was a painful reminder of how pervasive these issues were, but at the same time, each message was a testament to the fact that they weren't alone anymore. They were all standing together in this fight for respect, for basic humanity. The overwhelming flood of support made Michael feel like he wasn't just one person anymore. He was part of a larger movement, a movement that sought to lift up the voices that had been silenced for far too long. But with that realization came a heavy responsibility. He knew that the battle wasn't over, far from it. The people who had treated him with disdain were still out there, and their attitudes weren't going to change overnight. The airline had issued a public apology, but that felt like nothing more than a band-aid over a much deeper wound. They had promised to review their policies, but Michael knew that those words meant little if they weren't backed up with real change. The system, as broken as it was, couldn't be fixed with a few empty statements. Still, Michael wasn't backing down. He had made a commitment to himself that he would continue this fight. Not just for him, but for everyone who had ever felt unseen, unheard, or unworthy. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew the road ahead would be filled with obstacles, and there would be times when he would feel like giving up. But there was one thing he knew for sure: he wasn't going to stop. One day, after a particularly exhausting week of interviews and meetings with advocacy groups, Michael received a call from an unexpected source, the flight attendant who had taken Max away. Her name was Rachel, and though Michael initially hesitated, he took the call. The conversation started awkwardly, with Rachel apologizing for her actions. But as she spoke, Michael could hear the hesitation in her voice, the discomfort of someone who knew they had done something wrong, but wasn't sure how to fix it. "I'm sorry," Rachel said quietly. "I really am. I never should have taken your dog away like that. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I realize now how hurtful it was. I didn't see you. I didn't see your humanity, and for that, I'm really sorry." Michael stayed silent for a moment. The words felt like a small but significant step in the right direction. He could tell that Rachel wasn't just apologizing to get it over with. She seemed to genuinely regret her actions. But there was more to it than just an apology. There had to be a change in how people like him were treated. A change in how people saw those who were disabled or who didn't fit into society's narrow definition of normal. "I appreciate your apology," Michael finally said, "but apologies don't change anything. We're not going to fix this just by saying the right words. We have to do the work. We have to change the way we treat each other. We have to make sure this doesn't happen again." Rachel's voice was steady now. "I know. I want to do better. I'm going to do better. I've been working with a disability advocacy group to learn more about how to treat people with disabilities with the respect they deserve. I've been reading about how ableism and racism are so deeply ingrained in our society. I didn't realize how much I didn't know." Michael listened, taking in her words. It was a start. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a start. People didn't change overnight. And even though it was hard to accept, maybe this was a chance for something meaningful to happen. "I'm glad to hear that," Michael said. "But you can't just learn from a book. You have to listen. You have to listen to people who have been hurt, people who have been overlooked, people who have been dismissed. I don't just want you to apologize. I want you to help make things better. Help change the system. Use your position to speak out against injustice. Help raise awareness." Rachel was quiet for a long time, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was full of resolve. "I promise you I will. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again, and I'll do everything I can to help make sure others don't go through what you went through." Michael felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't expected. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. Maybe people like him didn't have to keep fighting an uphill battle forever. Maybe the world could become a little bit better, one conversation at a time. The rest of the week passed in a blur of media appearances, speaking engagements, and community outreach. Michael was tired, but there was a sense of purpose driving him forward, a fire that refused to go out. More people reached out to him, not just to share their stories, but to ask for guidance. They wanted to know how they could fight back, how they could make their voices heard. For the first time in his life, Michael felt like he had the power to make a difference. The isolation he had once felt, the sense that he was fighting alone, began to fade as he connected with people who were just as passionate about fighting for justice as he was. The more he spoke out, the more he realized that his voice mattered, his story mattered, and he wasn't going to let anyone tell him otherwise. The journey ahead was still long, but it was a journey that he no longer had to walk alone. He had Max by his side, and he had the support of countless others who had found their voices through his. They had all been silenced for far too long, but now they were speaking out. Together, they could create the change they wanted to see in the world. And Michael knew without a doubt that they were going to make a difference. Weeks passed, and the story that had begun with a humiliating incident on a plane had slowly evolved into something much larger than Michael could have ever imagined. His voice, once so quiet in the face of injustice, was now a beacon for those who had long been silenced. As the days went by, his life was consumed by interviews, discussions, and rallies. Each day, more people reached out to him, thanking him for his courage, sharing their own stories of hardship, of being treated unfairly, of fighting for the simplest rights that should have been theirs by default. It was overwhelming, but in many ways, it gave Michael a new sense of purpose. He had never thought that his small stand would echo so loudly, that his pain would resonate with so many others. The story was no longer just about him. It was about the countless others who had faced discrimination, humiliation, and hate, but had no platform to speak out. But as much as he appreciated the support, the constant media attention began to wear on him. It was exhausting. The late nights, the endless meetings, the rallies that never seemed to stop. There were moments when Michael longed for the quiet, for peace, for a time when things were simpler. But he knew deep down that he couldn't stop now. His fight was far from over. The pressure started to build. Each new conversation, Each new platform where he had the chance to speak added weight to his shoulders. He wasn't just talking about the incident anymore. He was talking about something much bigger. He was talking about systemic racism, about ableism, about how the world so often chose to overlook the struggles of people who were marginalized. It was a fight he hadn't chosen, but one he had no choice but to engage in. And though he was tired, though his heart ached from the emotional toll, he knew this was what he had to do. Then one day, a letter arrived. It wasn't from the airline. It wasn't from a politician or a government official. It was from the young woman who had first stood up to Michael, the flight attendant, Rachel. He had been surprised when she had reached out to him, her words apologetic and sincere. She had said she was working with advocacy groups, trying to educate herself about disability and racism, and Michael had, at first, been skeptical. But the truth was, seeing her willingness to learn, to change, gave him a small sense of hope. That hope was tested when the letter arrived. Rachel had taken the time to attend a community event, one that focused on issues of racism, disability rights, and inclusivity. She had asked Michael to come with her. She wanted him to see the change she was trying to make, to see that she was truly committed to learning and growing. It wasn't much, but it was something real. Michael debated it for days. It felt like an overwhelming request. Could he trust her? Could he, in good faith, step into a space where someone who had wronged him was now trying to make a difference? He had every reason to be wary. But as he thought about it, about all the people who had reached out to him over the past weeks, he realized that this was about more than just one person's apology. It was about showing the world that change was possible, that people could grow, that they could do better. Maybe Rachel's actions would be a small part of that. The day of the event, Michael stood in front of the venue, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. Max was by his side, as always, offering silent comfort. Michael took a deep breath, trying to push away the fear that lingered in his chest. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. Inside, the event was already in full swing. There were panels on racial justice, on disability rights, and stories of people who had fought, and were still fighting, for their place in a world that often overlooked them. Michael sat quietly, listening to the conversations, hearing the voices of others who had been in his shoes. It was overwhelming to see how many people had suffered, how many people had been treated with indifference, how many had been told they didn't matter. But at the same time, there was a sense of unity, of solidarity in the room. They were all in this together. When it was Michael's turn to speak, he took a deep breath and stood before the crowd. His heart was racing, but he was ready. The words flowed easily, as they always did now. This fight had become part of him. "I never thought I'd be standing here today," he began, his voice steady. "But here I am. I've spent my whole life feeling like I wasn't enough, like I didn't belong, like the world wasn't made for me. But here I am, and so are all of you. Every one of you who has fought, who has struggled, who has been told they don't matter. We are here, and we are not going away." The crowd nodded in agreement, some standing, some with tears in their eyes. The power in the room was palpable, and for the first time in a long while, Michael didn't feel alone. He felt seen. He felt heard. Rachel stood beside him. The apology from her, from the flight attendant who had been part of his pain, felt genuine now. She wasn't just there to speak the words. She was there to act. It was a long road ahead, but they were all in this together. And for the first time in a long while, Michael allowed himself to believe that change was possible. As the event ended, people came up to Michael to thank him, to share their stories, to tell him how much his courage had inspired them. He smiled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. This wasn't the end of his journey. He knew that. But it was a beginning of something bigger than just one fight, bigger than just his experience. It was the beginning of a movement to make people see one another, not as strangers, not as problems, but as human beings deserving of respect. And Michael knew, deep down, that this was just the start. There were still many battles to be fought, many systems to be dismantled, many hearts and minds to be changed, but he wasn't alone anymore. He had Max by his side, and he had the strength of those who stood with him. Together, they would fight for a better world, a world where everyone had a voice, a world where no one was overlooked. This was just the beginning. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What did it mean to you? Have you ever experienced racism or seen it in your own life? Your voice matters, and we truly appreciate each and every one of you for taking the time to listen and engage with this story. Your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and giving us a like so we can continue sharing powerful stories. We value you and all of your feedback. Have a wonderful day, and don't forget to leave a comment with the phrase, "Change begins with us," to show that you listened all the way through.